The opulent restaurant buzzed with a low murmur, the clinking of silverware, a rhythmic backdrop to hushed conversations. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow on linen-draped tables, each one a tableau of expensive food and even more expensive suits. Then, a sound cut through it all, a sharp, sudden slam that made every head turn. At a large, round table near the back, a man, clearly the center of attention, had brought his fist down with surprising force. This was Mr. Kim, a name whispered with a mix of respect and fear in certain circles. His face was contorted, a mask of pure rage. He spat a torrent of rapid-fire Korean words, his voice raw and guttural. The people at his table, a mix of nervous American associates, shifted uncomfortably. They looked at each other, then back at Mr. Kim, their expressions blank with incomprehension. Even his American translator, a young man with slicked-back hair, sat frozen, wide-eyed, and visibly terrified. He stammered, trying to piece together the furious phrases, but he was clearly out of his depth. Mr. Kim's tirade escalated. His eyes, dark and piercing, burned with an almost unholy fury. He jabbed a finger at a menu item, then pointed accusingly at his own untouched plate. His voice rose, a roar that silenced the last vestiges of polite chatter in the room. The message, even without translation, was stark. Mr. Kim felt profoundly disrespected. His authority, his very presence, had been challenged in a very public setting, and he was not about to let it slide. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. Everyone in the restaurant felt it, a collective holding of breath. Amidst this chaos, a young waitress named Sarah paused, her tray held steady in one hand. She was clearing plates from a nearby table, moving with a quiet efficiency that often made her seem invisible. Her expression remained neutral, almost detached, as she listened intently to Mr. Kim's rapid-fire Korean. Others might have heard only angry noise, but Sarah heard words, phrases, and the underlying currents of his fury. A flicker of understanding crossed her features, quickly followed by a calculated resolve. She took a deep breath, barely perceptible, and her gaze, usually downcast, became unwavering. Without a word, she stepped forward, moving with a calm purpose that contrasted sharply with the trembling fear of the translator. Sarah calmly addressed Mr. Kim, her voice cutting through the heavy tension like a sharp knife. She spoke in flawless, eloquent Korean, her words precise and imbued with an undeniable authority that instantly commanded his attention. Her tone was not defiant, not challenging, but firm and clear. She wasn't arguing, she was stating facts, explaining the misunderstanding with a clarity that had been entirely absent until then. Mr. Kim, mid-sentence in his furious rant, froze. He was momentarily stunned, his anger visibly deflating as he listened to her speak. The roar died in his throat, replaced by a quiet hum of awe that rippled through the room. People exchanged bewildered glances. Sometimes, the quietest voices carry the greatest weight, someone whispered, though no one was quite sure who. Sarah finished speaking, her gaze still fixed on Mr. Kim. His expression was unreadable, a complex mix of surprise, grudging respect, and perhaps a flicker of something else, embarrassment. The table, and indeed the entire restaurant, held its breath, waiting for his reaction. The true depth of Sarah's intervention and its far-reaching consequences remained shrouded in anticipation. What would happen next? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Sarah's story began far from the polished chaos of that high-end restaurant. In a bustling Korean-American neighborhood, nestled within the sprawling expanse of Los Angeles. Her childhood was a vibrant tapestry, expertly woven with the rich threads of traditional Korean customs and the dynamic, sometimes jarring energy of American culture. It was a place where two worlds didn't just meet, they merged, creating something unique and complex. The community was tight-knit, a comforting embrace of familiar faces and shared experiences. Every morning, the aroma of spicy kimchi wafted from open kitchen windows, mingling with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Saturdays were for Korean school, followed by trips to the local H-Mart, where the aisles hummed with Korean chatter and the promise of familiar flavors. Family honor was not just a concept, it was the bedrock of existence, a silent rule that governed every decision, every interaction. As the eldest daughter, Sarah felt the weight of these expectations most acutely. Her parents, first-generation immigrants who had sacrificed everything for a better life, instilled in her a deep, almost reverent, respect for her heritage and, crucially, for the Korean language. It wasn't just a means of communication. It was a link to their past, a key to their identity. Her daily routine was a structured rhythm of responsibilities. School, where she learned English and American history, flowed seamlessly into helping at her family's small Korean grocery store. She stocked shelves, chatted with regulars, and sometimes translated for her parents when a customer didn't speak Korean. Evenings were often dedicated to more Korean language and cultural classes, honing her already impressive fluency. The neighborhood, while a sanctuary, was also a microcosm of the struggles and aspirations of immigrant families. She saw the quiet determination in her parents' eyes, the longing for their homeland, mixed with a fierce pride in their new one. She witnessed the constant balancing act between preserving tradition and embracing change. Sarah harbored a quiet ambition, a dream that felt both enormous and fragile. She wanted to become a successful interpreter, a true bridge between cultures. She envisioned herself dismantling misunderstandings, forging connections where others saw only gaps. Yet her quiet demeanor, her natural shyness, often led others to underestimate her. She was observant, a keen listener, but rarely spoke out unless necessary. This made her feel invisible sometimes, like a ghost moving through conversations, hearing everything but rarely being heard herself. It was a frustrating paradox for someone who dreamed of being a voice for others. Even then, Mr. Kim was a looming figure in the community. Though not directly involved in Sarah's daily life, his name was whispered with a mix of fear and grudging respect. He was known as a powerful businessman, often ruthless, his reputation preceding him like a dark shadow. He symbolized a certain unyielding authority, a force that bent others to its will. Ura, in her quiet way, always observed him with a mix of apprehension and fascination. She saw how people deferred to him, how his presence shifted the dynamics of a room. His influence was pervasive, an unspoken current running beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful community. He represented the kind of power that could crush dreams, the kind that made people silent. His early presence in the narrative established an emotional backdrop, highlighting the vast social chasm between a powerful figure like him and a quiet, unassuming girl like Sarah. It was a stark reminder of the world she lived in, a world where voices like hers were often unheard, and where men like Mr. Kim held sway. The weight of Mr. Kim's influence wasn't always a direct blow. More often, it was a slow, steady erosion, like water wearing away stone. Sarah, with her quiet observations, saw the cracks forming in the foundation of her community. These weren't personal clashes with Mr. Kim, but rather the subtle, pervasive effects of his power that slowly chipped away at trust and respect. She saw it in the hushed conversations, the worried glances, the way people changed their plans based on unspoken fears. Stories circulated like hushed warnings among the shopkeepers and families. Mr. Kim had a reputation for broken promises. There was the tale of the dry cleaner, Mr. Lee, who had invested his life savings into expanding his business, only for a promised partnership with one of Mr. Kim's ventures to mysteriously fall apart. Mr. Lee lost everything. Then there was the bakery owner, Mrs. Park, who had been assured a prime spot in a new development, only to be pushed out at the last minute by a business connected to Mr. Kim. These were not isolated incidents. They were repeated patterns, deals that fell through, leaving small entrepreneurs in financial distress and fostering a growing sense of resentment and powerlessness. Sarah heard these stories, saw the despair in the eyes of those affected, and a quiet anger began to simmer within her. The community felt trapped, unable to fight back against such an entrenched force. Sarah also witnessed veiled humiliations, moments that spoke volumes without a single loud word. She saw how respected community leaders, men and women, who had built their reputations on integrity, would subtly defer to Mr. Kim. At community events, their voices would soften when he entered. Their posture would shift. A forced smile would appear on their faces. Even when his actions were questionable, when rumors of unfair dealings were ripe, these leaders would nod along, offering placating words. It was a silent acknowledgement of his power, a sacrifice of their own dignity for what they perceived as peace. These acts of deference, though not directed at Sarah, instilled a quiet fury in her. She saw the imbalance of power, how fear could make even the most respected individuals bend. It wasn't right, and she knew it. Then there were the instances of manipulation and injustice, subtle yet devastating. Mr. Kim's influence permeated community affairs. Whispers of him influencing local elections, ensuring his preferred candidates won, were common. Business permits for new shops or expansions seemed to move faster or slower, depending on their perceived connection to his network. Intimidation was his silent weapon, creating an atmosphere of fear and distrust. People learned to walk carefully, to speak cautiously, to avoid crossing him. Sarah, with her keen observational skills, saw these patterns clearly. She recognized the threads of control, the way he pulled strings from the shadows, shaping the community to his will. It was a slow strangulation of independent spirit, a quiet suffocation of justice. The audience now understood that Mr. Kim's outburst in the restaurant, that dramatic scene in Part 1, was not an isolated incident, not a sudden fit of temper. It was the culmination of years of unchecked arrogance and disrespect. It was a public display of the same disregard for others that had quietly simmered in the community for so long. His behavior at the dinner table was just a louder, more visible version of the disrespect he had shown to countless others, in countless ways, for years. Sarah's intervention, her decision to speak up, wasn't a spontaneous act of defiance. It was a reaction to a much deeper, long-standing pattern of behavior, a boiling point reached after years of witnessing injustice and silent suffering. She had seen enough. The emotional atmosphere in Sarah's community grew heavier with each passing month. Mr. Kim's influence was like a thick fog, slowly covering everything, making it hard to breathe. His aggressive tactics, initially subtle, became more open, casting a long shadow over local businesses and even social gatherings. People started to avoid certain topics at family dinners, their eyes darting around as if expecting to be overheard. The joy and easy camaraderie that once defined their neighborhood began to fade, replaced by a quiet tension. Small disputes, once handled with friendly talks and compromises, now turned into tense standoffs. Local entrepreneurs, trying to make an honest living, found themselves constantly clashing with Mr. Kim's associates. These conflicts weren't about fair competition anymore. They were about power. Discussions about community development, about improving their shared spaces, often got derailed by Mr. Kim's demands. He seemed to want everything to go his way, no matter what. This led to a palpable frustration, a kind of unspoken anger that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Everyone knew what was happening, but nobody dared to speak up too loudly. The social pressures mounted, slowly but surely. Neighbors and relatives began to feel like they had to pick a side, to align themselves with Mr. Kim, or risk unspoken consequences. It wasn't about direct threats, not usually, but more about being left out. About business deals suddenly drying up, about a cold shoulder at community events. Social gatherings, which used to be lively and full of laughter, became strained. Whispers and glances followed those who dared to express even the slightest dissent. It was a subtle form of control, but effective. People started to censor themselves, to hold back their true feelings, just to keep the peace, or what was left of it. The community, once so united, felt like it was fracturing, piece by piece. Mr. Kim's public behavior, meanwhile, grew more overtly dismissive and arrogant. He started flaunting his wealth and power more openly. He would drive through the neighborhood in expensive cars, surrounded by his entourage, barely acknowledging anyone. He treated those around him with increasing contempt, as if they were beneath him. This only solidified his image as an untouchable figure, someone who operated above the rules that applied to everyone else. He seemed to enjoy the fear he inspired, the way people would step aside when he approached. It was a clear message. He was in charge, and everyone else was just there to serve his interests. Sarah felt the full weight of the community's unspoken judgment and fear. It was like a heavy blanket pressing down on her. She watched her friends and family make compromises they never would have considered before, all to appease Mr. Kim. Her aunt, who ran a small flower shop, started buying her supplies from a distributor linked to Mr. Kim, even though it cost more. Her cousin, a talented chef, had to adjust his restaurant's menu to include dishes favored by Mr. Kim's associates, even if they weren't popular with his regular customers. These small acts of surrender, multiplied across the community, painted a grim picture. This period marked Sarah's greatest emotional suffocation. She felt trapped by the pervasive fear and injustice, watching as the spirit of her community slowly chipped away. She yearned for a voice, a way to express the outrage and despair she felt, but she wasn't sure how to wield it. Her quiet observations, once a source of strength, now felt like a burden. She saw everything, understood the subtle power plays, but felt powerless to change them. The injustice burned within her, a silent fire, waiting for an opportunity to ignite. She knew something had to give, but she couldn't yet see a path forward. The silence that had settled over the community, heavy and suffocating, was about to be shattered. This was not a slow erosion anymore. It was a sudden, violent crack. The turning point came, not with a bang, but with a whisper Sarah wasn't meant to hear. A conversation that would change everything she thought she knew about her quiet place in the world. It was about her family's grocery store, the cornerstone of their lives, and it was under attack. One evening, after closing the shop, Sarah was tidying up in the back room. Her parents, usually so careful about what they discussed, were talking in hushed, urgent tones in their small office just off the main floor. The door was ajar, and their voices, usually a comforting murmur, now carried a sharp edge of panic. Sarah froze, her hands still on a stack of empty boxes. She heard her mother's voice, tight with worry, then her father's, heavy with defeat. The words that tumbled out of the office were like a punch to her gut. Mr. Kim's organization was pressuring them. They wanted the store. Not just any store. Their store. And they wanted it for next to nothing. A drastically undervalued price that wouldn't even cover their debts, let alone their years of hard work. Sarah's parents were on the verge of losing everything. The small grocery store, with its familiar smells of spices and fresh produce. The place where Sarah had spent countless hours growing up, where generations of their family had poured their sweat and dreams, was about to be taken from them. The despair in her father's voice, the quiet sobs from her mother, cut through Sarah like a knife. This wasn't just another business deal gone wrong. This was a direct assault on her family, on their livelihood, on their very identity. Mr. Kim's tactics had escalated, becoming even more aggressive. The veiled threats and intimidation that had been used on other local businesses that refused to cooperate with his expansion plans were now being aimed squarely at her family. It was clear that he saw no limits, no boundaries. He was systematically dismantling the community, one small business at a time, and now it was their turn. This wasn't just a threat to her family. It was an attack on the heart of her community, a final, brutal blow to everything they cherished. Witnessing her parents' despair, seeing the systematic dismantling of her community firsthand, something shifted inside Sarah. The quiet, observant girl who had felt so powerless was gone. In her place stood a determined advocate. She realized that her fluency in Korean, a language she had learned from birth, and her deep understanding of both cultures were not just skills. They were her greatest weapons. She had watched, listened, and learned. Now it was time to act. She refused to stand by and watch her family lose everything. She refused to let Mr. Kim continue to terrorize their community. Then, almost miraculously, an unexpected opportunity arose. A prominent legal firm, one known for investigating organized crime activities, particularly within the Korean-American community, was looking for a temporary interpreter. It was a coincidence, a chance opening. But Sarah saw it as a sign. It was her path, the chance she had been waiting for. This position, initially just a job, became her doorway, her chance to expose Mr. Kim, to fight back against the injustice that had plagued her community for so long. This moment broke the cycle of suffering and fundamentally altered the story's trajectory. Sarah was no longer just observing. She was stepping into the fight, ready to use her voice. The decision to join the legal firm, to actively work against Mr. Kim, brought with it a heavy weight. Sarah suffered deeply, not just from the practical challenges, but from the emotional turmoil. She grappled with doubts, a constant knot in her stomach. Could she really confront someone so powerful, so ruthless? The fear of jeopardizing her family further was a constant companion. Every night as she lay in bed, the faces of her parents, their despair etched into their features, flashed before her eyes. What if her actions made things worse? What if Mr. Kim retaliated, not just against her, but against everyone she loved? The fear was sharp and real, but beneath it, a deeper, more insidious emotion gnawed at her: shame. In her culture, challenging authority, especially an elder, was an act fraught with peril. a public display of disrespect that could bring dishonor not only to herself, but to her entire family. The idea of public conflict, of airing their community's dirty laundry, went against everything she had been taught. She worried about what people would say, how they would look at her parents. This cultural shame weighed on her, making her question her own resolve even as she pushed forward. Her emotional distress was profound. Sleepless nights became the norm, her mind racing with scenarios, strategies, and anxieties. There were moments of profound sadness, where she would find herself crying silently in her room, tears of frustration and fear. She even had arguments with her parents. They, understandably, were terrified. They had lived their lives trying to avoid trouble, to keep their heads down, to protect their children from the harsh realities of their adopted country. They saw her involvement not as a solution, but as an even greater risk, a foolish act that could lead to irreversible consequences. "Please, Sarah," her mother pleaded one evening, her voice trembling. "Just let it go. We'll find another way." But Sarah couldn't. She had seen too much. The community's reaction was mixed, a reflection of the deep divisions Mr. Kim had created. Some neighbors, upon learning of Sarah's new job and the implications, became wary. They avoided eye contact, their smiles strained. They feared Mr. Kim's wrath, the invisible hand that could crush their businesses, their livelihoods, with a single act of displeasure. Whispers followed Sarah as she walked through the neighborhood. Was she brave or foolish? Was she a savior or a troublemaker? Yet, amidst the fear and suspicion, there were cautious offers of support. Old Mrs. Lee, who ran the dry cleaner across the street, discreetly slipped Sarah a small bag of homemade kimchi, her eyes conveying more understanding than words. Mr. Park, the butcher, would sometimes leave an extra cut of meat in her order, a silent gesture of solidarity. And then there were the surprising allies. A few individuals, emboldened by Sarah's actions, quietly approached her, sharing their own stories of injustice at Mr. Kim's hands. They provided crucial information, details about his dealings, names of his associates, dates of suspicious transactions. These small acts of defiance, these quiet expressions of hope, fueled Sarah's resolve, reminding her that she was not alone. The cultural dynamics were a constant challenge. The deep-seated values of respect for elders, the avoidance of direct confrontation, the desire for harmony, these clashed constantly with Sarah's mission. The community was sharply divided. On one side were those who prioritized peace, tradition, and the quiet endurance of hardship, believing that challenging Mr. Kim would only bring more suffering. On the other side were those who secretly yearned for justice, for an end to the fear, for someone to finally stand up. The psychological impact on Sarah was profound. She navigated these complex social currents, trying to maintain her resolve, while understanding the pain and fear that drove both sides. She had to choose her words carefully, to move with precision, knowing that every action, every word, could have far-reaching consequences in such a tightly knit, culturally sensitive environment. Her own internal battle between duty and tradition raged, but the image of her parents' despair always brought her back to her purpose. The arduous process of rebuilding, both personally and for her community, now began for Sarah. Her continued work with the legal firm was meticulous, a painstaking assembly of fragments into a coherent picture. Each translated document, every nuanced conversation she interpreted, chipped away at Mr. Kim's carefully constructed facade. She uncovered a sprawling web of illicit activities, connecting seemingly disparate threads of shady land deals, coerced business takeovers, and money laundering operations that stretched far beyond their small community. The firm's investigators, guided by Sarah's insights into the local culture and language, were able to follow leads they would have otherwise missed. Through Sarah's meticulous translation and her deep understanding of cultural nuances, the legal firm gathered irrefutable evidence against Mr. Kim. His empire, built on fear and intimidation, began to crumble. The consequence for him was severe. A public indictment that sent shockwaves through the Korean-American community and beyond. The dismantling of his criminal enterprise wasn't just a legal victory. It was a symbolic one, a collective sigh of relief that echoed through the streets, businesses, and homes that had lived under his shadow for so long. People started to breathe easier, their shoulders visibly relaxing. The family grocery store, the very catalyst for Sarah's decision, was saved. The legal proceedings not only halted the forced sale, but also exposed the illegal tactics Mr. Kim had used to try and acquire it. Other businesses previously exploited by him also found renewed hope, many receiving restitution or the chance to reclaim what was unjustly taken. Sarah's actions led to a dramatic shift in power dynamics within the community, fostering a more equitable and transparent environment. The whispers of fear were replaced by conversations of possibility, of a future where hard work, not intimidation, determined success. Sarah, no longer the quiet waitress who had felt invisible, became a respected figure. She was a bridge builder between cultures, not just for the legal firm, but for her community. People sought her advice, not just for translations, but for her wisdom and courage. She reflected on her journey, acknowledging the pain and the fear that had been her constant companions. She remembered the sleepless nights, the arguments with her parents, the cautious looks from neighbors. But she also remembered the quiet nods of solidarity, the homemade kimchi, the extra cut of meat, the small, brave acts that had fueled her resolve. She understood now that strength wasn't about shouting the loudest or wielding power with an iron fist. It was about speaking truth to power, even when your voice trembled. It was about understanding, about connecting, about finding common ground in a world often divided by language and custom. Her initial act of speaking Korean at that dinner table, cutting through the tension with a calm authority, was the first brick in building a new foundation for her community. It was a foundation built on justice, respect, and the understanding that true courage often lies in the willingness to find one's voice, even when facing overwhelming odds. The community had found its voice through her, and in doing so, had found its way back to itself. Life was far from perfect, but it was now a life lived without the choking grip of fear, a life where justice, however hard won, could finally take root.